Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Lynne Hardy, who is the line editor for Rivers of London and an associate editor for Call of Cthulhu. We talked about police procedurals. That is the style of story that makes really good use of the structure of the police, where you can dive into crimes and tackle all kinds of interesting investigations. It is the foundation behind the newly released Rivers of London tabletop role-playing game. Lynne talks about how police procedurals play an important narrative role in Rivers of London and gives some insight into ways that you can manipulate the form for your own games. I'll jump across to that interview in just a moment, but first, please subscribe to our channel, and thanks for watching.
Well, the way I understand it, and the ones that I've usually ended up watching, are that a police procedural is where you have a crime, you have a mystery, and instead of your plucky amateur detective going out there and solving it, your Hercule Poirot, your Miss Marple, your Sherlock Holmes, you actually have a member of the police force or some other law enforcement division body go out there and deal with it. Usually they're quite complicated. They can tend to run on over series length things rather than episodic. Um, but you've got these investigators who are working allegedly within the law. I mean, let's face it, usually with these things, the protagonist is a lone wolf. He does things his way. He's deeply troubled. That's the usual kind of things. It hits all sorts of amazing tropes that you can really play with in role-playing games, actually.
Are these sort of shows, these sort of stories, a global phenomenon? Because I can think of American examples, I can think of all kinds of international examples, but I think that the UK and British media kind of has their own unique take on it, or perhaps they've just dived into it all a little bit deeper.
I think it's fairly universal, actually. I have a subscription to Acorn TV because I love my murder mysteries, and there's all sorts of French language police procedurals. There's all sorts of Spanish ones. There's they're all over the place. I mean, a couple of years ago there was a collaborative one that the BBC did with various different European partners, where they did sort of like not like a real life one or a live one, but it was kind of like they had sort of like multiple ones that were all part of the same spread, but they all took place in a different European city. So, I think it is, with cultural tweaking, you do get an awful lot of series that have law enforcement officers going off and investigating mysteries. They usually end up involving their personal lives as well, and it all gets terribly messy because sometimes police procedurals have a tendency to stray into soap opera territory the longer they go on, which is usually about the point at which I lose interest in them.
So, Rivers of London is kind of a police procedural tabletop role-playing game. You can play as a police officer in a variety of tabletop games, but that doesn't make them a police procedural game. What makes Rivers of London a police procedural game specifically?
The setup with Rivers of London is that if you're playing as recommended to begin with in the core rules, a member of the Folly. Now, the Folly is the magical branch of the Metropolitan Police Service. So they are part of official policing in London. So any mysteries that come to them technically have to be investigated within the bounds of the law, with the complication, obviously, that they're not dealing necessarily with normal crimes, they're dealing with magically related crimes. So the rule book kind of goes a little bit out of the window. But that's where that whole police procedural element comes in, because there is a framework and a hierarchy that they technically have to work within. Yeah, they have a bit more latitude than other members of the Metropolitan Police Service would normally have, because they're using magic and they're dealing with the demimonde, people who have been affected by magic, magical creatures, spellcasters, you name it.
So does this mean that if we're playing a game of Rivers of London, we're going to see rules about getting a warrant and finding the correct ways to source information or material, things like that?
Yes, and we actually give guidelines on that in the book. There's an entire chapter on policing and how that actually works for the Metropolitan Police Service, because a lot of people who buy this game aren't going to know that. A lot of people who live in Britain aren't going to know how the Met works. But we also say, never forget this is a game. You know, even the best researched police procedural TV shows take massive latitudes and liberties with how these things actually work. So, be aware of how it works in the real world, but don't be constrained by it, because no one out there writing police procedurals does. They all have their little things that they get away with. And obviously with Rivers of London, one of the ones is the fact that we know that not everybody's going to want to play a police officer. Sorry, watched Hot Fuzz again last night as research. So it's reminding me that it's police officer. So, that we have the Folly Consultants card, which allows civilian consultants to actually be in places where they shouldn't be, that, in the real world, they just wouldn't be allowed to be. And that's, again, something that you quite often see in police procedural type dramas, like Lucifer, for example, the first series of that. There's no way he'd be allowed to just wander in, even as a civilian consultant, to do various things. And this is, again, playing with a standard trope for police procedurals that means that it becomes a fun game and it is not rigidly tied to how things actually happen.
So, for people who don't really know about how the London Police Service works, or the London Metropolitan Police, because as you can see, it gets a little vague even for me. What is the technical purview of the Folly within the police force?
Well, to use Ben's own words, they're there to investigate the weird bollocks. Or rather, Chief Inspector Sewell's words. So yeah, they're odd. They're unusual. They get called in usually by other units, other divisions, when something doesn't feel right about a crime, when there's something a bit hinky about it, they will be brought in to look into it, to make sure that it isn't a run-of-the-mill crime.
And can an adventure take you down to Cornwall, or are you going to have to run into a extra layer of bureaucratic logistics there?
Well, to start with, we've kept the game in London, but there are, there's guidelines in the book for moving things elsewhere, as we've talked about before. So yes, you could end up going off down to Cornwall, go and investigate some weird hippie surfer dude magical thing going on. Why not? Cornish piskies might be on the rampage. You never know. So that then brings in another trope that you tend to find in police procedurals, is the consultant turning up on another local force's patch. So yeah, again, you can do that. You can certainly do that. The Cornish police work very differently to the Metropolitan Police Service. So that's going to add an extra element for you. You're strangers in a strange land with magical things running riot at Land's End, say. Maybe the Piskies are pushing the tourists off Land's End because they're fed up with them dropping ice cream wrappers everywhere. Who knows? So, but you've got the option to do that.
One of the most common things that I see happen whenever I run a tabletop role-playing game that is set in the real world is that my players immediately commit a whole host of crimes. They'll go and they'll break into places, or they'll cause collateral damage. And even if they're heroes, they do things that would immediately get them arrested. How does this change in Rivers of London? Are you held to account more carefully for all this sort of thing?
Oh yes, it's actually, for those who've read the novels, and the graphic novels as well, they will know that Peter is regularly held to account for causing massive property damage. It becomes something of an ongoing joke, actually, the fact that there's usually disaster follows him wherever he goes. So yes, and we discussed that too. There is accountability because you are members of a police force. You cannot just go round randomly blowing stuff up without there being consequences. There will be consequences. You do have a certain amount of latitude. Nightingale can fix a certain amount of trouble, but there are points beyond which, if you go, you are going to have to go see that. I think is the Directorate of Professional Services. The who watches the watchman, basically the people who are going to slap your wrists if you're naughty.
What about advancement within the police force? This is something that comes up a little bit in the Rivers of London books. As you gain experience, as you play out your investigations, and as you begin to master the arcane ways, are you also going to get promoted again and again and again?
you certainly have that option. We didn't go too much into exactly what you have to do to get promoted because it's actually really quite complicated these days. There's a whole host of exams and goodness knows what you have to do and training courses you have to go on. But we do point you in the direction of books that will actually tell you how to do that if you really, really want to go down that route. But yes, it certainly is. You're in the police force. Um, Peter is a police constable. He's a uniformed officer when he first encounters magic. He then becomes a detective constable. He moves from uniform to plain clothes into the detective branch. During the course of the books, he becomes a detective sergeant because he's done all his paperwork to do that. So, there are those options available for people who want to play the police.
So this is all super interesting details that surround the kind of police procedural aspects of Rivers of London. But in a more practical sense, what kind of stories does this let you dive into that you might not be able to in other TTRPGs?
It gives you the backing of the law to go in and go to places and do things that otherwise you would have to break the law to go do. Obviously within reason. You mentioned warrants. Yes, you might need to go get a warrant to do something, but it means that you can go do. There are people that you can talk to. There are places that you can go to, that you wouldn't. It might be easier to do as officers of the law than it would be as a civilian. You've got access to services that you wouldn't necessarily have access to as a civilian. One of the great things in the way that Ben set it up is the fact that whilst the Folly is part of the Metropolitan Police Service, it's also kind of weirdly independent and it has its own funding budget historically. So it's not as subject to funding issues as the rest of the Met. Although, you still really need to ask Nightingale's permission before you go and spend a huge amount of money on fancy tech. Um, so, you do have certain freedoms, you do have that official backing. I mean, obviously, we are all aware that there are certain issues with modern policing in all over the world, and we do talk about that too in the books because it's something that you have to address and it's something that does get addressed in the novels as well.
What about advice for keepers and for players alike? What kind of different style of play might you need to bring into your games if you want to run Rivers of London in that true police procedural style?
I think really it just needs to be a little bit more formal, um, in terms of, letting your superiors know what you're going to go do. Making sure that you don't use Nightingale as the solution to, and Peter as well, as the solution to every problem if the investigators get stuck. But it's also quite handy having that mentor figure there because if the players get stuck, you can always have Nightingale or Peter go, "Oh, have you thought of doing this?" And certainly one of the things we do with the first scenario in the book is we actually build that in. Nightingale wants you to come back and report what you've actually found. And now that's actually quite a handy tool for the GM as well, because then you know what the players think they know about what's going on. So you can marry up what the players think is happening and what you think is happening and adjust accordingly. So it's that kind of being within a hierarchy, having an ability to report back, and just actually having a way for the GM to check in to make sure that the plot's going how they think it's going, really, and that the players haven't entirely gone off in a completely different direction and grabbed the wrong end of the stick, as we are all wont to do as players.
We've talked a little bit about urban fantasy. We've talked a little bit about London as an interesting setting, and we've talked now about police procedurals. I know the next time we're going to talk about magic, but before we jump away, is there anything else you'd like to mention on the topic of police procedurals, on this kind of unique element that is coming into Rivers of London as a TTRPG, and that I'm quite excited to explore?
Having it as a police procedural is an interesting way of doing it. And it might seem quite intimidating because it might seem like it requires you to know a huge amount about policing, and it really doesn't. If you go out there and you watch any number of police procedurals, and there are some really good ones, if we're getting a bit old fashioned, Inspector Morse, even though Morse is a really horrible character, you've got Prime Suspect if you want to go your gritty end of things. You've got lots of lighter ones, somewhere in the middle. So, You've got a wealth of research material out there to go and have a look at to see how these things work. Don't be intimidated by it. It's one of the things we say in the book. Use as much of the actual way the police works as makes it fun for you and to give your game a little bit of structure, particularly if you're new to role playing. I think having that extra structure there of this formal service actually helps because you've got those sorts of guidelines to help you through and keep things moving forward. But don't be intimidated by it. At the end of the day, this is a game. It's there for you to have fun. You use what helps you have fun, you ignore what doesn't.